We have three panelists today. Mateo Romero sends his regrets. He unfortunately had another item that has taken his attention away from this. And the part of Mateo will be played by Tony Abeyta.
You'll channel him.
Who is extraordinary, and in addition to being able to do improvisational impressions, you all know his work, which is just luminous. We have Meredith here on the panel, who is only going to portray herself, but that's but she's about 12 people and does everything from meticulous artwork to with such research involved in, behind her work that it's sometimes stunning, the many layers of information that go into her work. I'll ask Tony first about how David came to your attention and what first caught your eye about his work.
First of all, let me preface this by saying I'm really honored to be here talking about David this afternoon, because David, I remember him when I was a young kid. My sister was at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and she was studying art, painting, sculpture there, and David was there at the same time. And the first painting I ever saw of his, of course, was the the pastiche that he had done of Henri Rousseau, but it was in a Native American theme, and it had a sleeping Indian, and I think there was a coyote there instead of the very famous lion. And it was nothing like I'd ever seen. I was so familiar with Indian art coming from the perspective of generally natives on horseback and hunt scenes. And my father was a painter that came out of the Dorothy Dunn School. And so my idea was pretty limited about what American Indian art could be. Now, David was part of a whole movement that was happening in the 60s. And you had Fritz Scholder, who was at IIA, you had T.C. Cannon, and there was a whole host of people who were affiliated with the Institute of American Indian Arts. And it was the magnet that probably brought David to Santa Fe, to New Mexico, and he stayed here and he worked and he painted. So I always knew about his art, but my real relationship with David and understanding who he was as a personality happened in the 80s when I later went to school at IIA. And during that period of time, David was immersed in this very militant kind of these sort of this movement that was against trying to keep non-natives from representing themselves as natives, and that they would be able, they had to identify what their tribe was. And he made it really simple. It was like, you have to have a pedigree if you're going to show in Native American Indian museums, if you're going to exhibit, along with other natives in group shows, prove the pedigree. And it didn't seem like such a big request at the time, but it was fierce, the reaction to it. Like, who is this artist coming to tell us how we have to, what kind of art we can do? And later it became almost sort of, it was this, it was very controversial, because there's a lot of people who were exhibiting within the context of Native American museums like the Herd, the Wheelwright, and so forth. And at the same time, I started seeing like this whole huge movement of people who were like, that David Bradley's a troublemaker, he's a hellraiser. So I knew David as the troublemaking hellraiser in Indian Chippewa was coming here, like making all this noise. And it was entertaining because he was painting a lot of the personalities in his paintings. He was, militant and showing up to openings, and he was just there right at a time when Indian art was just on fire. It was blossoming. There was money to be made in New Mexico, and Santa Fe in particular. limousines were pulling up to galleries, and they were, you know, letting out the celebrity artists, and they were showing up to Elaine Horwich and a host of other galleries at the time, Fenn. And so that was the beginning of where I met David. And there's much more to tell about it, but I'm not the only person here. But that's where it began for me. David is the Native American artist. David has been, commented socially and politically on a great many things about the commerce of the Native American Indian art market here in Santa Fe, about the politics of artists, cultures. He's been right there documenting Santa Fe for, the past 30 years. He's been, very important. His role has been very vital to the progression of where we now are within Indian art in this community. And a lot of people don't always know that. So I always mention that as what David's role has been. And we'll talk a lot more about some other things that David's done within the community, and he's a family man and great other things, and we'll talk about some other things. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to somebody else. That was Mateo speaking too. So I get a little extra time.
Thank you, Tony and Mateo. I loved the first Indian market where David was highlighted in the newspapers on the front page of all the market newspapers, saying, talking about the authenticity and Native art issue, and he was cast as a troublemaker, and he kept saying, "I'm not a troublemaker. The trouble was there. It was already there. I'm trying to address it." And he was trying to do that in his quiet way, but his quietness and stillness really set in motion a lot of activity. We were working on the Indian Arts and Crafts Act amendments at the federal level, and he was getting the New Mexico Arts and Crafts Act, which was the first in the country, and one that really shaped the federal one that we were doing. So that was wonderful to work with him on those issues, and they were very much misunderstood, and people were giving him death threats, and it was no small matter. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars involved in the marketing and promotion of people who were fakes, who were just pretending to be Native people for an advantage in the art market at a time when that was an advantage. So we were trying to build on how the Arts and Crafts Act began in 1933 or 34 as the Pseudo-Indian Act. That was the bill that went through, which just made it a federal criminal offense to present yourself as a Native person if you were not. And that turned into the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. But it started as that really strong act that criminalized this behavior, and then turned into something that was more civil, with civil penalties. But a lot was at stake, and David really can claim ownership of the New Mexico Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which was, again, the first in the country. America, how did David come to your attention, and was it his work or was it his political activism, or a combination of both?
Oh, definitely the work. I don't really know David very well, but he kindly was in an art show at my studio, which was kind of slumming it for you, so I really appreciate it. But I know David through his friends, fellow artists that really admire him, like Marcus Ammerman really looks up to him. Maggie Onazorgan, if you know her, she was an art dealer, and she really looks up to him. But I grew up in the native art world, but I grew up in Oklahoma, so I always heard tales of Santa Fe. I love that piece by Richard Ray Whitman. It's like, when native artists died, did they go to Santa Fe? And so this time period, the genre paintings are my favorite. You know, the slice of life, a lot of humor, all these personalities. But David's documenting this history that it's kind of the 80s, the heyday, where, I mean, I just hear tales. I never got to attend Indian Market during the 80s. But it was really high stakes. It was incredible. The careers were just flourishing. And I have heard tales. It's funny when you hear the gossip that's told about you, but that David was really targeted by Jimmy Durham and the other charming fellow, Ward Churchill. So I'm so grateful. I'm Cherokee. And I'm just so grateful that there was that act passed, because everyone decides they want to be Cherokee. So thank you for pushing it back a little bit, because Ward Churchill does not represent my tribe. And I think an important thing about the 1990 Indian Arts and Crafts, there's no law against being an artist. You can be an artist. Like, no one is preventing anyone from being an artist. It's just, if you have a tribal affiliation next to your name, you have a responsibility to that tribe. So I think it's good just to kind of steer things, make people a little accountable. But this history of Santa Fe, I think David really captures the emotions, the heyday of the time, the excitement. And I think it's really important in his work how he breaks down boundaries. So you'll see there's the Spanish-American aspect of Santa Fe, the Anglo-American, that he's not just, carving off his Ojibwe part of Santa Fe, that he's showing this interplay of cultures. And I was really impressed by how you reference Latin America in your work, which I think is really important because so many Native people live in Latin America. In Guatemala, there's twice as many natives as in the United States. But we kind of stop at that border, and I'm glad that David doesn't stop at that border.
Tony, I wonder if you could talk about of all the art series that are represented in this exhibit, one or two that particularly catch your eye.
Well, David's spectrum of work has covered a lot of, mainly it's figurative work, and it does represent the tricultural parts of Santa Fe and this region. And so when I think about David's paintings, I think about, art history and how it had an effect and influenced, what he does as an artist. He looked outside of just the Native American Indian box and started looking at European art and bringing a lot of that home, and then history. And then he was looking at, the relationships between, the northern New Mexico Hispanics, the Anglos, and the collector's art market, and then the Native, even feast day rituals and the community. So the work that appeals to me the most, it would be that work that represents community and that represents specifically Santa Fe. So when I think about that involves the Pueblo world and feast day and eating and everything that happens outside of the window of that room that's in there, the window to the outside world. So when you look at those paintings, you'll see there's usually a window and you see a lot of activity, as much as going on outside as there is going on inside. And it's going on underneath the table, it's going on all over the place. And you have to look at all the minuscule things that are happening. So you have to engage and spend some time trying to figure out all of the details that he's put in there, the metaphors that are in there, and then the inside jokes that are part of it too. There's all of these paintings, a series that he did of openings that they did for the Herd, or when they went to Denver Art Museum or to New York, and there were invitationals of artists, or Los Angeles, and there were invitationals of all the artists who were included. He would have, he had put Emmy Whitehorse in there, or John Quick to See Smith. He would have Fritz. He would have Gorman. He would have people in hot tubs. He would have collectors. Everybody found themselves in his paintings, whether they wanted to be in his paintings or not. There they were. So there's people that have been part of his life that end up in, those paintings. And I remember being young and I was like, I hope I never end up in one of his paintings because I don't know what he's going to do with me. And I think he put me in the big one, which I like. And I think he has me maybe I'm on a cell phone, right? Because here I am like this. I'm like, yeah. I don't got time to talk right now. I'm in a lecture. So that's what I like the most about his work, is it calls you into them to look and spend time, engage in all of the details, the landscapes, the animation of the clouds. The mesas take on like a spiritual presence. Like they resemble spirit figures. The clouds, or the sun. There's all of the vegetation. His stylization of the landscape became his own way of painting, rolling hills and the patterns and everything that is part of New Mexico landscape. So that's what I responded to the most, was the fact that he was having a dialogue about the community. Here we are living in Santa Fe, where all these different people, we're all very, very unique. And there was a lot of fun things that were happening in the 80s when he was doing these paintings. There was, it was a really booming time. And it was the first time in Santa Fe that it saw an explosion on real estate. Many of you were there, and many of you weren't there. I got in here right in the middle of it. And I started seeing like real estate going through the roof. There was galleries popping up all over the place. There was hundreds of galleries. Everybody was making money. There was a whole camp of sculptors. I think they called themselves NARC, Native American Stone Carvers. And so there was all these sculptors that showed up, and everybody was doing sculpture, and everybody was making money and selling these, like they called them flying eagle heads, because it was like a face with the kind of a hair that kind of went to the side, and then it turned into an eagle or bird or something like that. And so everybody was doing all of this, and everybody was making money. And then everybody was jumping on board. They were like, wow, I can be an Indian artist too. And Indian artists are just making money because it was a niche market. Yeah. And later on, it kind of lost its flair, and it became commercialized, and people were like, whoa, I don't want that in my house. That's just too mainstream commercial. But it wasn't. In the beginning, there was some really great art that was being made, and it was being made by native hands in a community of people who were informing one another, and we're making this, some really great work. And that all started at IIA. I truly believe IIA has been the magnet for a great many Native artists who've found a community where there's a support system, and then there is also galleries to represent your work, and there's collectors that show up to buy it. So it's built right here. You don't find that in Phoenix or Denver or Chicago or any of those places. It's here. People come here to cultivate art. That's why we're all here in this Native Art Museum. We have museums. It's the only place really that has Native art museums. So he's looking at all of this, and he's documenting every minute of it. Every year, every show, every Indian market, every feast day, every altercation, every time they burn Zozobra, every time somebody gets drunk, somebody gets laid. It's just like there's all of these different facets of Santa Fe, and he left no stone unturned. And he puts people in there, and you're now part of the legacy of David's work. So I know that's a long-winded answer to a question about what work do I like of his the best. It's a spectrum of all of those things. It says everything about community. That's what we're kind of touching a little bit on. And next person.
Yes, the same question to you.
Well, I'm really drawn to the genre painting, and I think it's really important that a lot of the history from the 80s and the early 90s, before internet was ubiquitous and everyone could just post every single thing they do, that it's really important that he's documented all these personalities, and I'm really drawn to kind of the mythological and cartoony kind of things that get interjected. I really love Godzilla versus Zozobra, because you're going to Santa Fe, but Santa Fe is definitely overshadowed by personalities in this. So the fact that Lone Ranger, Tonto, George O'Keefe is a specter all over the state of New Mexico. So I think it's interesting that painting, in grad school, I don't know if you had to too, I had to constantly defend the idea of painting, like, why do you paint? And to me, painting, you can take your internal vision and externalize it and share it. So the fact that a photograph wouldn't capture all these mythological figures that are kind of dominating conversations and gatherings here, but in painting, we can kind of see inside the internal world.
I particularly like the Anishinaabe fishing rights series where David has a walleye or a salmon just mounted on board, like you would see in any bar in the Great Lakes area. And it was very important at the time that he started doing that series, because fishermen in the Indian fishermen in the Great Lakes area were doing night fishing, and so they had flashlights on their heads to look down into the water, and anti-Indian hate group people were on the shores of the lakes throwing stones at them, and it was a perfect target. They would throw at the light to hit them in the head, and it spread throughout the various communities of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people, and it was so awful that even the Indian Boy Scouts in certain communities were being exiled, excommunicated from their Boy Scout troop, for crying out loud. And there was one group stopped treaty abuse. We're marketing treaty beer, and so a lot of people who thought they were supporting treaties would buy this, and we did mount a successful boycott to that. So it was a really important time to do something that would read in the Great Lakes area and anywhere else. Just, here's the fish, here's the Anishinaabe people have fishing rights in the ceded territories, and that's the end of the discussion. And court cases were going on. The father of that set of court cases was George Bolt in Western Washington, and on February 12th, just a few days ago, we just passed the 41st anniversary of the Bolt decision, and Judge Bolt out there was being hanged in effigy and burned in effigy because he had made a decision saying the Indians in the Pacific Northwest were eligible for, in accordance with their treaties, 50% of the anadromous fish, the fish that love the water and love the rivers, the fresh water as well, love the ocean water and fresh water, and that they were eligible for 50% of the harvestable catch in their usual and accustomed fishing places, and on and on and on. He just read the treaties properly, and that transmitted to the Great Lakes area, and all of those fishing rights cases were broiling. So out of this and all of this turmoil and a lot of near-death experiences, David was really stepping into another hotbed issue that needed another kind of voice saying, this is really simple, folks. This is here, there's one, court cases are one thing and they're important and essential, but there's nothing like something that just reads visually. And David is so good at capturing that. He really has been the eye on Native America and the eye on America, if you look for all the figures in the feast days. I love that Georgia O'Keeffe is always around, and Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo are always around. They and the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and people. It's not a precise message. It's just an image to give you a feel for what he's trying to say as the main subject. So you have some of these people reacting in peculiar ways, and I love that he puts himself in the El Farol painting where he's playing his saxophone, which he really does. It is very nice. And here, the day after Valentine's Day, what a sweetheart to do the self-portrait as the heart with the protective hand. That I think that's lovely. So when I first looked at David's work, I could see the influences of Central America, and that was one. He had served in the Peace Corps in Guatemala and Costa Rica, and a lot of before going to IAIA, and a lot of his paintings reflect that certain styles from there. And I wondered if America or Tony, if you would like to comment on that kind of influence in his work.
Well, I do like the fact that you referenced Mayan temples, and the border piece I thought was really strong. I don't know if you all have had a chance to see that, but the fact that you're referencing Tarahumara people who are one of the candidates for possible descendants of the Mimbres people, the Mogollon culture. So it's kind of interesting that, before a couple hundred years ago, people traveled back and forth, exchanged ideas. Mesoamerica is where we got corn, we got tobacco, a lot of the ceremonies and stories have come from there. I mean, my understanding, and any Hopi in the room can correct me, that the snake dance came from Mesoamerica. So I'm really happy that you're kind of reflecting that. And also the completely ratcheted up color scheme is fantastic. I think that's something really enticing. I think most Native artists that really want to you're trying to convey a harsh reality and some really harsh information about genocide and racism and poverty and struggling. So I think we've all developed tactics of, because you can't just yell at people, right? I can, but it's not very effective. But so you try to entice people, kind of lure them in. And one way is just through beauty, just sheer beauty, the sheer beauty of the colors, the humor, and that kind of lures people in and makes them feel okay that, you're not yelling at the audience, you're trying to bring them over, again, dissolving those boundaries. So I think the beautiful colors, the humor really definitely does that, but completely got off topic. Mateo?
All right, this is Tony here. I own two paintings by David, and one of them is an earlier Rousseau-looking landscape with a Chippewa girl lounging by a little stream, and there's some ducks in there. There's two bears on either side of it. It's pretty early, probably from late 70s, I suspect. And the other one is a Dia de los Muertos, sort of grouping of some little skulls, all in a sort of pop, modular arrangement. And both of them kind of speak about different parts of his career and what he was focused on. And when I think about my favorite painting that he's ever done of all time, it has a lot to do with this discussion, but my favorite painting that I ever saw is a small painting that was on paper, and it was of the Rancho State House Church, because I used to live up in Taos, and it had a bishop or a priest, and he's got a little native on his knees, and he's got his hand on the little native's head, and the title of it was called Indian Being Saved. I think so. Is Indian Being Saved. And I thought, what a powerful image. You know, we all know what that's about. We're talking about Christianity. We're talking about, you know, how when we're talking about ritualism and we're talking about the connection to the earth and to ceremony and indigenous belief systems and all of those things were completely eradicated, and they were just like taken and replaced with Christianity. And when you go to the Pueblos, they marry those two things together. They come out of the church and then they engage in deer dances, you know? And so there's those two things working side by side. And they've learned to adopt both of them and make them work for different reasons. But people practice both. And people say, how can, you know, you can't have one and have the other. And I'm like, yes, you can. Go marry a Pueblo woman, you'll know. And so they make that happen. And that said, you know, that's what happened to a great many cultures, and not only in South America, but also here in the Southwest, and basically California as well. I mean, there's a great many places where, you know, the Christianity, Catholicism came in and replaced a lot of what was a very, you know, colorful, beautiful, ritual, you know, way of life. And he touches on that, you know, when he has a depiction of Zozobra. You know, what is Zozobra? It's this pagan, you know, god who's being burned, but he was introduced by this white guy named Will Schuster. Said, this would be fun, let's burn this guy and let's do this pagan ritual. And then the Hispanics said, no, this is ours, we're gonna keep this. And so it becomes everybody's. And we've adopted some new ritual that is now part of Santa Fe's legacy. So I think about that painting of, you know, a small adobe church made out of the earth, and, you know, somebody with really good intentions, like, I'm saving this Indian today. I'm going to keep him from his pagan belief systems. And there's this Indian, you know, on his knees, and he's like, I don't know what's going on, but I hope there's food after this. So, you know, I don't really know what the question is, but I really like I like the story of those three things, you know. There's a painting of mine in my life that's of a Chippewa maiden, and it's romantic and it's beautiful, and she's immersed in nature. And then one that's about ritual and death and rebirth and celebration of death, which is kind of pagan in itself. And then, you know, an image of Christianity, Catholicism, and, you know, indigenous peoples. So those things have, you know, basically the roots of what David's dialogue with Indian art have been. Wherever he's getting all the information, he's getting it from everywhere. He's getting it from the, you know, community, from history, from art history, from his own personal experiences. And there we are. That's all I know on that.
Well, I love the layers upon layers upon layers of appropriation, reappropriation, misappropriation. And I really loved, I mean, there's so much there. That's pretty much, you could teach an entire college course on this show, no problem. But I think it's really important, his very beautiful streamlined bronzes, the sculptures, have a very Art Deco influence. And Art Deco, you can find plains stone pipes, smoking pipes, that are very streamlined and very Art Deco from the 1800s. So this whole Western aesthetic, this Art Deco aesthetic, kind of came from the plains, then became American, you know, mainstream, and then David's like re-indigenizing this, you know, kind of tracing it back to its roots. And I think we all know this, you know, that Native people don't live in isolation, that we have TVs, that we look at museums, that we study art. But I think sometimes, like, we're not putting ourselves in boxes, but sometimes outsiders try to put us in boxes. So I think it's really good that you're showing, like, yes, I understand European art.
I should point out that the cynical Miss Indian America image is not Arlene Loretto. But she's the one in with in one painting with the Mona Lisa in a frame slightly askew, and Arlene looking lovely, and then that beautiful bronze of Arlene, which is just magnificent. Those really caught my eye, but I like the detail of Miss Indian America having an end of the trail watch, and the Hollywood agent calling on the cell phone. Very, very showbiz, very commercial, and just right out of the chute, and building on one kind of stereotypical event on top of another, and just this idea of Indian royalty and princesses and that whole sometimes inexplicable pattern that we find in Indian America. In looking at the entirety or the range of David's work, what kind of impact would you say that it has had over the scope of his doing art in Santa Fe? And talk a bit about the abstract work, the new abstract work.
Well, I thought it was interesting that you went from acrylics to oils, because usually, people don't really do that. I don't know, I wish you could speak about it. But the colors still stand through, so maybe it's a kind of a purification, just a pure enjoyment of color and the palette. And I'm always trying to defend painting as a concept, but I cannot think of a art form that can encompass more ranges of colors, more subtles and more brilliance, because film can't do it, video can't do it, jewelry can't do it.
So I think the first part of your question was about the impact of David's work in the full context of contemporary Native American Indian art. So we are coming out of the 60s, and we get some, big powerhouse personalities. We got, Shoulder, Cannon, Earl Biss. There's a number of people just came right out of IIA. And who takes the limelight really is Fritz. Fritz is like dealing with stereotypes. He's dealing with the Native American image, and he's, getting the last word and, what Native Americans have to say about their image and the image making. But then I think about the, David's real impact on Indian art was dealing with the angst, that a lot of natives had. There was an immense amount of frustration with everything, with the commodification of everything, with the imagery that, that was representing Native Americans. Of course, the stereotype is still really predominant, even with younger artists. That's what they're focused on right now. It's like, this is not who we are. We're really cool. We're really progressive. We're intelligent. We're well-traveled. We're a lot of great things. We're traditional. We're ceremonial. We're all of these things. But I get back to that moment about the angst, David had a lot of drive, and that was all coming from this really personal frustration that he had with the way things. He wasn't willing to accept it. He wasn't willing to say, he was like, screw this. I'm not going to just allow this to happen. And so he became militant about it. And he started using the art as a way of venting it, to deal with it, almost as a form of therapy. But also, his message was being read by a great many people. So, if you were buying art from Elaine Horowitz in 1987 or 1988, and you were showing up to her openings, and you were buying David's art, and you were buying a painting by Randy Lee White, you would have to reckon with the painting that you would have of David's, knowing David was, chasing him down and saying, hey, show me the tribal affiliation. And there were a great number of people who were targeted, really by David, and they, either you took it personal, or you showed up with the pedigree, or you didn't have the pedigree, or it was the momentum to change and make your art, authentically your own. And a great many artists, it got them to move out of like, okay, so I don't have to do Indian art. I'm a great artist as is, so I could start getting into what I'm really built to do. And so, and that happened. But there were a lot of people who might say David's, actions impacted their careers tremendously. But this is such a long story. This is such a long book that all of us were, that we're all have a chapter in it. We're all like, trying to figure out what being an artist is, and, where does our art fit? What message do we have to say? Where is our contribution in all of it? And that's where it boils down to. Like, and David's contribution was he made change. He made impact. It's a different marketplace that we live in today. And that goes down to like jewelry that's made in China, that's fake turquoise. I mean, we got all of this like stuff to protect the fact that like, hey, here's how we represent ourselves, and we have some legal backup. We got some like policing that happens because people did the work to make the change. Now, if David didn't make the change, maybe somebody else, but what if they didn't? And the whole, and the damage that was done, most of us don't even recognize that. The fact that when you go to New York or you go to Los Angeles or some of the bigger metropolitan cities, and you tell, like, I'm a Native American artist, and I'm proud. I've always defined myself, first as a Native American Navajo contemporary artist. That's how I've always been. I don't say, first I'm an artist that happens to be Native. I'm actually a Native American artist because I'm proud of that. But the rest of the world looks at that and says, oh, you do that kind of art. Yeah, that's like this, I don't like that kind of art. It's too regional. It's too commercial. And then they think of, they throw me in this pot of, I don't know what it is. It's a Mato Peña, with a little sprinkle of Gorman, and it's a little bit of Tavlos, Coyote, and, all of these things. And they throw me all in there, and I'm like, whoa, wait up. Look at my website. Look at, I'm doing video art. I'm doing all this stuff. It's like, no, it's okay. Sit down. And there you go. The damage is there. And that happened because people were just coming in and saying like, money, Santa Fe, Adobe.
Coyotes.
Yeah, howling coyotes. I mean, where the damn coyote got the bandana from? I don't know. This was happening. Like, I was right there. I was right there watching everything, the coyote bolo ties, and some of us in this room own one of them, I'll bet you. And that was all happening, but that wasn't really us. That wasn't what Native people wanted to be. That's not who we were. So there you go. That's the impact David had. David made change. David made the change momentum, and it was all birthed from immense frustration with a marketplace, with stereotypes, with situations. He was like, I'm not gonna take this shit. And there were repercussions, there were death threats. There were people like, oh, you're gonna get it. You're gonna see. Like, you ruined my last show. I'm not making as much money as I did last year because of you, David Bradley. And he was to blame. So that's all I got to say about that.
Well, I really like the word angst because it's a good Swedish word. But the early work, we haven't really talked about that, but it's great to see retrospective and see an artist that feels comfortable changing, because there's at least 4 completely different means of creating art in there. Very Art Deco sculpture, the new non-objective abstraction, which is, kind of very open and new, the genre painting, and then the protest art. I mean, that's kind of what I grew up in the 70s in Oklahoma. The stencils, and angst is the perfect word because it's this desperate desire to communicate with the mainstream world. And there are traces of elitism in the native art world, but not very much, because for the most part, native artists don't want to prove like, oh my God, I'm so smarter than everyone else. Most people just desperately want to communicate and want to tell their stories. So I think that's kind of good for the public, that no one's trying to play games with you. We're trying to get the message across, and I think David did that very beautifully.
David got the credit and blame for a lot of things that really started in the 1920s with John Collier, the poet and lawyer, who later became the BIA head in the Franklin Roosevelt administration with the Indian New Deal, and that started, and he really started the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. But in the 20s, he was organizing in New Mexico and New York to get some star power behind the move to solidify economic development where it belonged, so that if you said your pottery was made by a Jemez potter, it better be made by a Jemez potter. That's what that Pseudo-Indian Act was about. And the people he enlisted were Felix Cohen, who later became the New Deal solicitor for Indian Affairs, or solicitor for the Interior Department, and who was kind of the modern architect for federal Indian law, and Georgia O'Keeffe and D.H. Lawrence and lots of people who lived in New Mexico, and they were focused on Pueblo art, on Navajo art, on Apache art, that because it was here, but they really meant everyone's art, that, and they meant it as an economic development push. And also at the same time, they were trying to overturn the civilization regulations, which outlawed everything, 50 years of outlawing everything that was traditionally native. And so it had a religious freedom and cultural reclamation aspect to it as well. So when later in the 80s, David was trying to amend it to just strengthen the penalties and make it a stronger act. The foundation was already there. The law was already there, so he was just amending, and it wasn't just him. Lots of other artists were joining in with him, and some other people, some collectors and some gallery owners, but by and large, all the hate was directed at him. And he has often said that he was the most blacklisted Indian ever. And it's true. It did cost him positions in shows and fellowships and grants that might have come his way, and that continues even to this time. So I particularly want to applaud Della Warrior for coming in and right away as the new director of MIAC saying, look here at what David is saying in his work and what he's saying with his life, what he is doing. So I particularly like those. He also, being from White Earth Chippewa tribe, or band of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, he was called on by his fellow White Earth people, Vernon and Clyde Bellecourt, who were prominent AIM people, and Clyde had been one of the founders, and by Dennis Banks, who was also Ojibwe from Leech Lake, and who is Ojibwe from Leech Lake. And so they called on David often to do things like prisoner of war images for the freedom of Leonard Peltier, and various American Indian movement activities that they were trying to promote and publicize. And so a lot of David's imagery comes from those requests and that commentary on the time and what was happening at the time and what was happening as you reflect on that time. The word militant has been used a couple of times. I don't know that David ever picked up arms, but his imagery really has been used as both weapon and shield, both as an aggressive statement and as a protective shield, and I think that's evident in a lot of his commentary on society and in the ways he portrays well-known people. So I wonder if you, Tony or America, or both of you would like to zoom in on any particular piece of art and talk about that.
Well, David's painted everybody, and there's all these people in the paintings and the personalities he paints. It's so, like, when you look at them, and there's the sort of art history that you can see George O'Keeffe in the paintings, and then like the one painting he's pretty famous for is he did the Grant Wood's American Gothic, but he did him as American Indian, who's, it's really sweet because everybody knows the painting. I mean, he picked paintings that were famous, that everybody was familiar with, and then he would replace them and put natives in place. So you had to reckon with that fact, that like, whoa, wait up, that's not supposed to be. That's supposed to be this farmer, he's a white farmer, he looks like he's from Iowa, and now he looks like he's Chippewa? No, this isn't cool. And what, they're Navajos now? So in a way, it's very subtle, but very strategic. He's including us in the whole dialogue of art history. He's now saying, like, okay, look at the things that you know and you're familiar with are now, you have to reconsider, like, okay, the native component is there. All these Native Americans are here, and they're part of our art history. So he just sneaks it in, and he doesn't wait for you to discover. He just tells you, this is what it is. This is what's happening. Then you look at the group, the great big epic group paintings, which have got 30, 50 figures in there. And when you go in there, you'll start seeing personalities in there, and you'll say, like, oh yeah, there's Fritz Shoulder there. And then you'll see that there's Tonto and who's Tonto and
Lone Ranger.
Thank you, the Lone Ranger. But the Lone Ranger is now gay. He's a gay Lone Ranger.
Yeah.
And then you've got all of these people who are coming into, maybe there's Forrest Fenn shows up in one, and maybe there's, Elaine Horwich who shows up in another one. And those are people who have, if you've been in Santa Fe long enough, Elaine Horwich died eating chocolate, reading magazines in bed. And so there's that's part of Santa Fe's legacy. There's all of these different things that occurred, throughout the history. And so he celebrates those moments too. So he's documenting a time and a period that maybe not everybody looks and says, who the hell are those people? Well, we know some of them. And there's like Charme Allred in at least 3 or 4 paintings. And if you're from Santa Fe and you come to this museum, or you go to Indian Market or Museum in New Mexico, you know who Charme Allred is. She's a personality and an important contributor to Indian art. And there's others. There's everyone makes it into those paintings, and I think that's what's really great about them. But I go back to the other moment about art history and picking some of the great, like the Mona Lisa. He paints Mona Lisa as a Pueblo or Navajo, and there you go. That's now exists. It's out there for you to decide whether you think that that's okay, or it should go back to being, the Italian Mona Lisa and the Iowa, American Gothic. It's about reclaiming things, and also it's introducing the possibility that we are just as important, and we're a great subject matter for consideration as Native people.
I really like the Sleeping Indian, you know, the Rousseau based on the Sleeping Gypsy, but I like the fact that that David's taken the time to learn about other tribes, and he's kind of conveying all this information about other tribes' art. So I love the details of the Sleeping Indian he's Apache, and he's got an Apache fiddle with him too. So I think, so few of us get to actually take a Native American art history class, so I like how he's trying to slip in that little education. But it's also just a beautiful, haunting painting that kind of does have a completely different feel than the original. And just, I like the fact that it's kind of set in Arizona and not necessarily New Mexico too. So I find it really interesting that not only is he looking at all this European and mainstream culture, he's also looking at this incredible diversity of tribal culture and reflecting that.
It's a wonderful conclusion.